Hi, it's good to get back to our classes. I hope all are fine and healthy and safe. So we are going to start from where we stopped actually. So in this lecture we cover chapter 8, which is about interest rates. So before getting into the detail of interest rate, it's important to know some terminologies. Loanable funds, amounts of money available by lenders to borrowers. So any savings in your pocket or in your bank account, any lender, any creditor wants to lend, no matter to who, to bank, to a company, to government. So those volumes of cash, volumes of money are called loanable funds. Of course, this lending process is not for free. So whenever you give me your money for 1 year, you are expecting to get some extra on your original or your principal back. So that's so-called interest rate. Simply, interest rates are the price of the loanable funds in the financial market. So we have been talking about financial markets. So it's a place where lenders and borrowers can meet and can get to an agreement about borrowing and lending loanable funds, lending money, lending cash, funds in the financial markets. Okay? So at which rate they are agreeing upon. The price of loanable funds, which is interest rate, is determined by the volume of supply and demand of loanable funds. So there is a theory which is supporting this idea called loanable funds theory. This theory holds that the rates of interest is a function of supply and demand for loanable funds. So supply and demand for loanable funds determines the price of loanable funds. Okay? So how these supply and demands affecting the interest rate. Okay. Suppose we are here. You may be familiar or not, I don't know. So this curve, these lines representing the supply and demand. And this is the volume of money, the volume of loanable funds in the market. This is the interest rate. It means that if the supply of loanable funds is here and the demand is here, so the intersect of supply and demand over here determines the price of loanable fund, which is interest rate. It is 4% over here. Okay, so S1 D1, we are at the position of 1 and both supply and demand are at their initial position. Okay, so we go over the other figures to learn how this mechanism works. Here we assume that the demand increases and the supply is the same, S1. Okay, demand increases from D1 to D2, but the supply is the same. Okay, and quantity of loanable funds were here, but now shifts to the right. It means there are more demand for quantity of loanable funds. Interest rate increases. Okay, so when demand for loanable fund increases, interest rate increases. I could write it here actually, these circumstances. Supply and demand for loanable funds. Okay, the first scenario is if demand increases, interest rate will increase, or interest rate will rise. This is the first case. Okay, so this also tells us that if demand decreases, R will decline. Now, we saw that D1 shifts to D2, having supply unchanged, interest rate increases to 5%. Let's see. Now, we have demand here not changed, but supply decreased. Okay, supply of loanable fund decreased. What happened? Interest rate increases. Interest rate rises to 6%. Okay, so if supply increases, R declines. If supply decreases, R will rise. Okay, so here in this case supply decreases, shifts to the left side, so interest rate rises. But if supply comes to this side, we have such a line and the equilibrium will be here. It comes, the interest rate falls below the initial point, and it can be, for example, 3, 2, or any other number below 4%. Now, if supply decreases, and demand also decreases, shifts to the left, but not by the amount that the supply decreases. It's less. Okay, you see this between two lines of D1 and D3. So this space is smaller than this space. So that will decrease the interest rate because demand decreases. Okay, so that's how the price of loanable funds determined in the market, and this has been supported by a theory of loanable funds. Okay, so what are the factors that supply and demand, affecting the supply and demand for loanable funds. First of all, okay, we have 6 factors according to this approach, and those are the main factors actually that affect the interest rate. Volume of saving. So how much savings are there in the market? How much individuals are saving? How much companies are saving? And we know that the saving goes to the financial market, and savers will move their money to the borrowers or to the sellers of the bonds. So how much savings are there? And savings will be affected by income. So the volume of savings is another factor that shifts the supply and demand for loanable funds. Expansion of deposits by depository institutions. So whenever we talk about depository institutions, just remember the commercial banks. Okay? So according to the policy of the commercial banks to that period, for example, how is their credit policy? How much they are facilitating to lend money? And that's the policy of commercial banks affects the supply and demand for loanable funds as well. Liquidity attitudes. So lenders and even borrowers are thinking about the liquidity for a period, like for how long you want to lend your money, for how many years, and whether you can liquidate this debt, this loan or not. So that also affects the supply and demand for loanable funds. For example, because of lack of liquidity in 2008, there was no loanable fund in the market at all. Even for high prices, even for 20% prices, you couldn't find it. Okay? Interest rates. Interest rate itself affects the loanable funds volumes. Okay? So whenever the interest rate goes up, people are showing their money to lend instead of having their own business, putting their money to another investment. They are just giving the money to borrowers and lend their money. They prefer that. Okay? And actions of the banking system, the Fed and the government. So central bank basically determines the interest rate in the market. So they have central bank, the Fed Reserve in the United States. They have their rate which will be benchmarked to the interest rate in the market, which is risk-free rate. So whenever banking system, for example, recently, because of the coronavirus, America did lower the Federal Reserve, which is Central Bank of the United States of America, lowered the interest rate from about 2, I don't know, but to almost 0. So that affects the loanable funds in the market. International factors of course, affecting the interest rate. For example, if interest rate in Japan is 6%, but in the United States is 3%, so people will take their money out and they will bring it to Japan to lend it there, invest it there to get higher rate of return. But instead, international factors affecting. So immediately, United States or the market will be adjusted to any change of international interest rates. So these are 6 factors that affecting supply, that affecting the supply and money for loanable funds. Sorry for this small grammatic mistake over there. And now, so we have many types of interest rate. The one we are talking about is market interest rate. When you go to market, for example, the central bank interest rate can be 2%, but the market interest rate can be 10%. This is due to many factors, okay, that affecting this one. For example, so small r over here represent the market interest rate, which equals to RR, real rate of interest rate. Okay, what's that one? That's the risk-free, as I said, government, central banks rate of return. Okay, in the United States calls risk-free RF. Why? Because it's free of the risk of default. No matter what, the American government, the American state will pay you back your money. It's zero risk debt over there. Inflation premium is another factor that affecting the rate of interest, market interest rate. So inflation, with the expectation of inflation over the period, over the life of the debt. If it's for 2 years, if it's for 3 years, if it's for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. So the lender will think about it. Okay, for example, I can give you an example about that, how inflation works. Let's say we are in 2020 and inflation rate is 2%. In 2025, inflation rate is expected to be 15%. Okay? %. So now, if I lend my money, lend for 5% interest rate and 5 years maturity. Then I will get 5% extra of my money. But I can buy, inflation is raised by 13%. So I cannot buy my money, which I get back with interest, has no power as it was in 2020. So what's inflation? It's a kind of purchasing power of money. Okay? So if I could buy 10 eggs here, let me extend this example. 10 eggs equal $1. But in 2000, 10 eggs equal $1.15. But the money which I get back is $1.05. So instead of earning money, I'm losing money over here. Okay? Another thing is that affects, so this inflation premium will be considered by the lenders in the market. Okay? And while they are setting the market interest rate over here. Default risk premium, it depends on like who is the borrower. If it's a reputable big company, United States government, actually no, it's not United States government, because government is borrowing at the risk-free rate. If it is any company, so they will be categorized or ranked by the default risk. The good, big, powerful companies can have lower risk of default, but the small companies and other companies may have higher risk of default. Maturity risk problem. Premium, sorry. So premium is a kind of additional rate for this risk. Okay, maturity. So the longer the maturity, the higher the rate will be. Okay, and also we have liquidity problem. It's very important whether this loan is liquid or not. Sometimes people change their mind, so they want to turn it to cash for small loss and invest it in some other investments, or they want to pay it back earlier. So here we have interest rate. So let me solve a problem regarding this one. Assume that real rate of free risk is 2%. IP equals inflation premium equals 1.5%. Default risk premium equals 2.5%, and we have maturity risk premium. Let's say the bond, the loan will be for 15 years, and that's why MRP equals 3%, and liquidity premium equals 1%. So what is the market interest rate? Equals to what? R equals 0.02 plus 0.015 plus 0.025 plus 0.03 plus 0.01, and equals, how much will be that one? 1, 2, 3, and it will be 4. 10%. 10% or 0.1. Okay? So if I ask it in the exam, you're going to be answering me in this way. Very, very simple. 1 plus 1 equals to 2. Piece of cake. But the thing is, you should not get confused with decimals and percentages. Okay? That's the first one. And second one, I may give you this rate, but ask you for real rate of risk-free interest. Or I may ask you like how much the lenders charge for the default risk of this company. So you will put everything here and solve for this. Very easy, again, piece of cake. So, talking about default risk-free securities, as I said, it is the U.S. Treasury bond or U.S. Treasury bill or Treasury notes. Okay, all are the same, all are bonds, but the differences are in terms of maturity. Treasury bills have the maturity up to 1 year, not more. Okay, Treasury notes have from 2 years, more than 1 year, to 10 years. Treasury bonds from 11 to 30 years bonds. Okay. And why it's risk-free? Because it has no risk that the US government will not pay you back. They are not going default. So that's why default risk-free securities are the US debt securities. And we have two types of these risk-free securities: marketable government securities, non-marketable government securities. Marketable government securities, if you buy it, it means you are lending government money. And if the maturity is for 5 years, just before the maturity, you can take your bond into the market and sell it. A can sell it to B, B can sell it to X, X can sell it to Y. No matter who's holding it, okay? But non-marketable government securities, it's just between a person or institution and the government. So you should redeem it with the United States government. So you cannot sell it in the market. It's not marketable, okay? It's not marketable. It's non-marketable. You cannot sell it in the market whenever you want before the maturity. Okay? This shows us the default risk-free securities in terms of maturity. So 32% in 2006, okay? 32% of the bonds were Treasury one. 37% was the Treasury notes from 1 year to 5, and 17% was from 5 to 10 years, and so on. So we have total in this. But in 2008, exactly during the global financial crisis, okay, this rose to 48%. So 48% of the market of the risk-free debts was 1 year maturity, because of the liquidity at that time. Okay, But anyway, after the recovery from the financial crisis, even this rate stays higher. So what we understand from these numbers, the short maturities are preferable always. Okay, within 1 year or 1 to 5 years maturity. So why we are covering the maturity over here? The term or maturity structure of interest rates. So this expression here explains the relationship between interest rate and the time to maturity for debt instruments of comparable qualities. Okay, and we have yield curve, which is this curve. Okay, so these are the rates and these are the periods. Okay, like during the 1980s, okay, exactly in 1980, the 1 year rate was high, but longer maturities was lower, and it was 16% at that time. But what about later on? 2006, 1 year rate was, it's almost the same, no matter whether it's for 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20 and 30 years. It's a kind of 5%. So according to the economy situation, these rates will increase. Okay, but after that, after the global financial crisis, and even 2012 and 2015 and even 2019 up to 2019, the yield curve was in this shape. What is that telling us? If the bond has longer maturity, the rate is higher. Okay, 10 years rate is higher than 5 years. 5 years rate is higher than 1 year's rate. So the longer the maturity nowadays, the longer the maturity, the higher the interest rate on the debt will be. Okay. So term structure theories. We have 3 theories that explaining the term structure of the interest rate. Expectation theory states that the shape of this yield indicates investors' expectation about the future inflation rate. This curve is downward. Okay, so the shape of this curve, according to the expectation theory, is determined by the expectation of the investors about the inflation in the future. So they think that inflation will come down in the future. That's why the interest rate will decline in the future. And they were correct. They were very much correct. Okay? The same as here. So since 2008, the yield curve is just the same shape. It's upward slope. We have another one. Liquidity preference theory states that investors are willing to accept lower interest rate on short-term debt securities that provides greater liquidity and less interest rate risk. Okay, let me give you we have a debt with high liquidity and R equals 11%. And we have a debt within low liquidity and R is 9.5%. Okay, so whenever you want to borrow some money, so you have these prices in the market, obviously this costs less, okay, but this costs higher, 11%. One would go for 9.5% if you are insane. But this theory says, liquidity preference theory says, the investors will go for this one even its higher rate with high liquidity. Because it's high, it has high liquidity. So they are willing to pay higher rate, but in case the debt security is high liquidity. So you may wonder why liquidity, because it's a debt and you are paying it back. No, the US debts, you can sell it in the market before the maturity. Okay. Also, we have market segment theory states that the interest rate may differ because securities, different maturities are not perfect substitute for each other. So we have here 1 year debt, 5-year debt, 10-year debt. These are not substitute for each other. Okay? Here. These types are not substitute. For example, you need money, you need to lend, you need to borrow some money for 1 year. You are not going to buy a 10 years maturity bond. Why? Because it's a little bit cheaper. No, you are not. You need money for 1 year. Why you are holding a bond, borrowing for 10 years? So these are not substitute. Okay? So that's another point which determines the shape of this yield curve. So those was the term structure theories, and you should know about them. That was the end of this chapter. Actually, I shortened this chapter for you, otherwise it's a long chapter. And here are the review questions. What's interest rate and how it is determined? So here is the interest rate, and it will be determined based on supply and demand of loanable fund. Okay, first slide. Describe how interest rates may adjust to an anticipated increase in the inflation. So if inflation increases, the interest rate will increase. And if its inflation rate is expected to decrease, so the interest rates are expected to decrease. And we have a theory that explaining this one, expectation theory. What are the main sources of loanable funds? Indicate and briefly discuss the factors that affect the supply of loanable funds. So the factors are 6. We have been through them, and what are the main sources are individuals, actually, households, me, you, and other people. What are the factors in addition to supply and demand relationship determine the market interest rate? You have the answer as well here. Here. These are the factors. Okay? Those in dark blue are the factors. What's the term structure of interest rate and how it's expressed? Identify and describe the 3 basic theories, blah blah. They are here. Okay? And we have a problem over here to be solved, but I will let it to you to solve for yourself. If you find difficulty, let me know. We will solve together during the online sessions. Okay, so read the slides, watch this video, and prepare any question that comes to your mind for the online sessions. Thanks for your attention and wish you all the best.